everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Leadership Blend with your host, Ricardo D. Rice, and we are in episode 12. Yes, it's been 12 episodes, and I thank you guys for sticking it out, and actually, hopefully you're learning something, and you have your pencils and your pads right beside you. So as we always do, I'm going to start with the recap, because last week was a lot of information, but hopefully you practice it within the week to see that it's actually effective information. So last week we went over all the different types of generations, and how interacting with those generations can make a difference in your organization, your ministry, or your church. So the first one that I discussed last week was baby boomers, and baby boomers were birthed between the years of 1946 and 1964. They're very team-oriented. They thrive off their attributes are individuality, resourcefulness, opportunistic, hard workers, strong work ethic, and some extra little things you might want to know about baby boomers, who are typically the oldest generation, is they have very good company loyalty, job dedication, continual learners, and they have a thirst for knowledge. As far as leadership preference, they prefer transactional leadership, which the name implies exactly what kind of leadership that is, meaning it's like a transaction. You tell me what to do, I do it, we're done. That's kind of the kind of leadership they prefer. I always tell people millennials and baby boomers, yeah, they kind of like oil and vinegar. They don't really mix, and you usually have to have Generation X and Y to kind of fill the hole so that they can actually get along. But that's only because baby boomers kind of paved the way for millennials. So millennials kind of got the fruit from all their hard work and all their labor. So they tend to be a tad bit spoiled, and that's how baby boomers view it. So you might want to be careful when interacting with the both of them. And if you have a church or a ministry, you're going to have both, because typically your baby boomers are either your senior pastors, they're your oldest deacons, they're your elders. Your youth people are typically the people in your social media departments or your media departments, or they're probably on a youth choir or a youth department. So they're in your church. So you just want to be mindful of interacting and interacting with them differently whenever you talk or communicate with them. All right, so the second one is Generational X, and they prefer to work alone. They avoid teamwork. They're more independent. They have a higher level of adaptability. They follow the mantra, they like to work hard and play hard. They discard company loyalty. And some extras are they seek balance. They're more loyal to bosses and co-workers, and they like to lead and follow. So Generation X was kind of that in-between generation that kind of still had the two-parent households, but they got to see other types of interactions amongst their parents. And they prefer transformational leadership, which again, the name kind of implies what kind of leadership it is. The ideology that my leadership style can transform you into a better version of yourself. So those are typically preachers, nonprofit leaders. We typically tend to use transformational leadership because of the ideology that we have. You know, church's belief is that the Word of God will change you and make you be your best self. So when it comes to that aspect of leadership, that's typically how we view it. So it's a little servant leadership, the ideology that you serve to become a good leader. But that's a whole other topic that I'll get into a whole nother time. All right, Generation Y. They have a group mentality. They prefer group tasks. They have a can-do ideology and a high level of trust in authority, and they like to establish connections. They do tend to be a little higher maintenance. They do like immediate feedback and attention. They're great multitaskers, and they like mentorships and relationships. And they actually respond to situational leadership. So again, when I say these different types of leadership, the root name that's in it kind of tells you what it is. So situational leadership implies that your leadership style adjusts to every type of situation. So you wouldn't deal with a sinking ship the same way you would deal with a car accident. Different types of leadership. Or you wouldn't deal with millennials the way you would deal with baby boomers. Different types of leadership. So it's situational leadership. All right? And last, but definitely not least, because they are the biggest class outside of baby boomers, the millennials. And they are born from 1982 to 2000. And they encourage group interactions. They value education. They're self-sustaining. They multitask well. They're pretty tech savvy. And they're masters of social media. Some extra information is they expect open communication, close relationships with supervisors, and they like parameters to be set. So they like to know what they can and cannot do. They don't like a lot of guesswork. They kind of like for it to be kind of clear cut, which is ironic because baby boomers operate the same way. They want to know what it is, what are we doing, and what is the result from what we're doing. So it's kind of funny that they do have attributes that are kind of the same, but not the same. And they also respond to situational leadership, the ideology that your leadership will adjust and adapt to any situation that they may find themselves in. Now, it's important to be mindful of the particular groups or generations that prefer teamwork and don't prefer teamwork. So baby boomers They're very team oriented, but you'll find that baby boomers tend to be the leaders in their groups. Generation X does not like teamwork. They like to work alone. They typically avoid teamwork. I'm in that generation, so I absolutely agree with that. I'm not a teamwork type. I'm learning as I get older, but I'm not a teamwork type. Generation Y, they have a group mentality, and they prefer group tasks. So it's not really the same thing. Some people like working in a group. Some people like doing group tasks. With a group task, everybody's tasked with something. So you're in a group, but everybody knows what they're doing. When you're doing group work, it's kind of a collective. So you have to be mindful of that when you're doing it. So there's a difference between group tasks and group work. All right? And then millennials, of course, they encourage group interactions. So they don't mind interacting with the group. Doesn't necessarily mean they love group work. And we also have to be mindful with millennials because even though they're tech savvy, there are still some things they don't really like. Because like I said, I used the example last week. Most of the millennials that are in my internship departments don't really care for Facebook. They'll do Instagram, they'll do Twitter, but if you try to get them to do Facebook, most of them don't like Facebook because they feel like that's for older people, which I'm not going to say myself, but that's for older people. So you have to be mindful. Just because they're tech savvy does not mean they enjoy it. And at the end of the day, you want them to enjoy whatever task you give them. So you want to keep that in mind. All right, and also be mindful of the types of leadership styles that they prefer, because you don't want to be dealing with a baby boomer with transformational leadership. That's not their leadership style. So you try to give them inspirational words and writing stuff on the wall. Hey, today we're going to have a great day. They're going to look at you and say, no, what are we doing today? What is the results of what we're doing, and how long are we doing it? So you want to think about these kind of things when you're interacting with them. And for those that have ministries, it doesn't seem like it's important, but it is important because all these generations operate through your churches. When you get back to your pulpits on Sundays, look around your congregation. You have kids, you have seniors, you have some middle-aged people, you have young adults. These are all the different types of generation. And remember, with a generation, they're all born at the same time, the same year, and during the same timing. So they're experiencing the same types of things. So it's a collective ideology. All right, everybody, so in this next segment, you're getting a real treat because most of you know that I wrote a book last year called Calculated Conflict, and it's an actual leadership style that I came up with that I created from scratch. And it's really simple, and it looks at the results of conflict, how you anticipate it, how you maneuver it, and why it's necessary to take your organization or your ministry, yes, I said ministry, to the next level. So as you can see, it has the pretty art form onto it. It's a nice little book, less than 50 pages, so it's an easy read. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes & Nobles, Calculated Conflict by Ricardo D. Rice, doctoral candidate. All right, so let's jump right into it. All right, so most of the time when we talk about conflict, people immediately go to words like fight, war, things like that. And we think about what happens in the midst of those things. We don't actually think about what happens as a result of those things. So when I look at calculated conflict, that's the ideology. What happens as a result of conflict, whether it be personal, whether it be organizational, all those good things. So when you think about conflict, you want to think about, yes, it may be a war, yes, it may be a fight, but when it's over with and it's done, was my organization better? Did people say things that they normally would not say in the heat of a battle or in the heat of a war? Did people change their mindsets as a result of people actually being in the same room, sharing different thoughts, and actually what was the takeaway? So when you think about conflict, I kind of want you to start thinking about conflict in that way. That if we have this meeting, which I will say with all the organizations I work for, which I've been in the for-profit sector and the non-profit sector, conflict has been the biggest issue because most people want to avoid conflict. When what they don't think about is when we think about wars, what happens when wars are done? They sign treaties, they create partnerships, all those good things. In your organization, what happens when people get in fights or when people, have arguments? Typically, they're saying the things they've been thinking for a very long time, which leads you to sidebars and side conversations and fractions and all those good things. When you have war and you have conflict, people express those things they normally would not express because they're in that moment. So it's that frustration that gets exposed, and once it's exposed, you can actually deal with it. There's nothing worse than having a group full of people who are so tamed that they can't say what they think, they can't say what they feel, and they're just doing what they're told to do. At some point, that level of frustration, because we don't think alike, and we don't look alike, and we don't feel alike, so if we're not allowed to express those things and we don't have an outlet, it's just going to balloon, it's going to turn into something that's not good. So what you don't want to do is stamper out people's feelings, opinions, and thoughts. So when you think about conflict, there's two types of conflicts. There's personal conflict and there's organizational conflict. Personal conflict is exactly what it implies. It's, you getting into an argument or a shouting match with another individual because you guys realize that you don't have the same thoughts, or you think about things completely differently, or you do things completely differently, and it agitates the other person. When you think about organizational conflict, then you're thinking about so many different thoughts, so many different ideologies in one workplace. Remember this, in one workplace, you're liable to have 4 to 5 different generations. So you're trying to talk to your senior managers, who are probably baby boomers. You're trying to deal with your mid-management or your operations managers, which are probably Generation X and Generation Y. And then you're trying to deal with your team leads, which typically are your millennials, or your social media team, or your marketing teams, which are probably comprised of millennials. And then there is Generation Z, but we'll get into that a little later on. But just in that sentence alone, I just named 4 different generations who all think differently, who all move differently, who all have different attributes. So the ideology that your organization, be it a ministry or a for-profit organization, is not going to have conflict is beyond foolish. You're going to have conflict, and it's actually vital that you have that conflict. Because again, and let's use for example, let's say that you're in your ministry and your senior choir, which the ideology of senior choir is kind of funny to me, but your senior choir gets into it with your youth choir. And the problem is the senior choir feels like they should do hymns and that they should stick to what has worked for the last 30 years. Well, the millennials come in and say, we want to do some Kirk Franklin, and we want to do some Ty Tribbett. And they're like, well, you guys are bouncing around, and you're doing all the things that the world is doing. And they're saying, no, we're doing what's actually in. We're doing what everybody wants to see. The argument is going to be, if we do it this way, then more people will come to the church. Your senior choir is going to say, well, we've done it this way for X amount of years, and it's worked just fine. What do you do when you have that level of conflict? And that's just in a church setting. If you take that and put into a nonprofit, you can have the same variables. You have your senior leaders or your senior managers, your CEO, who is saying, well, hey, we've had this nonprofit for years. We service this particular community. Why do we need to change the community that we serve? On the opposite side, you have your volunteers, who may be millennials and Generation X, who are saying, I get that, but this place that we have been servicing has been gentrified, meaning that they've changed the whole ideology of it. The neighborhood doesn't look the same. The people that live in the neighborhood don't look the same. So then you get into this conflict, but it's a necessary conflict, because once people start saying how they feel and they're sitting at one table, the takeaway is different. So when you allow them the space to say what they say and to base their discussion on actual facts and statistics and stuff, or just what they see from the people that are in the field, it can change the whole landscape of the discussion and people's mindset. So you definitely want to make sure that you allow conflict, healthy conflict, to take place in your organization, because I can assure you that it will move your organization to another place, another realm. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want to have our employees, we want to have our organization be the best version of itself that it can be. All right? Now, when we think about frustration, which is the next outlet, frustration is exactly what the name implies. Frustration is kind of like when it all balls up and then it all explodes. This is when you see people fighting in the workplace. This is when you see, because I have seen this in churches, you see people getting into cursing matches in the sanctuary. People go to fisticuffs. All this is a direct result of frustration. How do you get to frustration? It's kind of what I said in the beginning. When you don't allow people to voice their opinions, you don't allow people to give suggestions, you don't allow people to give feedback, then it leads to this certain level of frustration. The ideology that my company does not care about how I feel, or they don't care about the thoughts that I have, especially if it's coming from the people that are at ground level. So let's say we'll keep it in the church. So your ushers, your outreach team, when they come back and they're actually in the fields and they come back and say to you, your leadership, hey, we're seeing these things in the field. I think we might need to adjust the manner by which we do things. And, most times the leaders will go, well, we're fine. We've been doing it for X amount of years. This is what we're supposed to do. And the famous one I love, this is what God has called us to do, and he's called us to do it this way. Not necessarily. The word may not change, but our delivery of the word may be adjusted. And it's not adjusted for the people. It just may be adjusted for the timing that we're living in. So you always want to be mindful of the people that are actually in the field, because the people that are in the field are actually seeing everything head on. But that's just a slight taste of frustration, and we'll get more into that in the next segment. Okay, so when we left off, I was talking about frustration and what it looks like, personal frustration versus organizational frustration. So when you think about frustration, I'm going to read this from my book because, hey, it's my book, so I'm going to read from my book. In both types of conflict, a breakdown or failure to communicate will lead to a sense of frustration. Frustration brings awareness that there is either a lack of communication or a failure to communicate. It is broken down into two categories: emotional and intellectual. Emotional frustration means there is a desire to act, but intellectual means there is a need to act. Personal frustration tends to be more emotionally based than organizational frustration, which is more intellectually based. Operating as a singular organism, personal frustration is more prone to be led by individual emotions. For example, you will hear phrases such as "I felt," "I thought," after experiencing personal conflict. The participants are less likely to count up the costs or weigh out the consequences before acting. Reciprocally, organizational frustration operates in the adverse. So whenever you hear people say, and you hear this when fights happen and after the fight's over with, well, I felt she said such and such, or I felt disrespected, or I thought she said such and such, those are proponents of personal frustration. When you think about organizational frustration, then you hear words like "we thought," "we felt," because in an organization, they're more collective. So they do things as one body. So that's some of the things that you think about when you think about the difference between personal and organizational frustration. Organizations operate more as a collective consisting of more thoughts, more ideas, and more input. Their frustration is going to be more intellectually based, or members will think more collectively about their conflict outcomes. For example, you will hear phrases such as "we thought," "we felt" after experiencing organizational conflict. They are more likely to consider variables such as family, friends, co-workers, and consequences. Emotional and intellectual frustrations are not exclusive to just one group. They can be both displayed in the opposing group and oftentimes will be. It is important to remember that all conflict is still based off individual thoughts and actions. So again, when you think about personal frustration, most of the time people get into it, the frustration boils up. Before you know it, they're at fisticuffs. Nobody's counting up the costs. It's just like, this is what I feel in the moment. This is what I feel I should do in this moment. This is what's going to happen in this moment. When you think about organizational frustration, people take into account, well, if I get into a fight, I'm going to lose my job. Or if I get into a fight, what's going to happen to my coworkers? Or if I get into a fight, or we really get into it, what's going to happen to the company for those that have a vested interest in a company? So those are kind of the two different things you're going to experience when you think about frustrations. Okay? All right, so after the frustrations, then you get into the channeling or the outlets, or what happens as a result of the frustration. Because all frustration doesn't always come out in actions such as fighting or things of that magnitude. There are other outlets or other channelings that you will see when you get into the outlets for frustration. All right? So typically you're either going to have an action, which is emotional, or premeditated action, which is intellectual. Meaning when you say premeditated, people have thought about what they want to do, how they want to react. When you think about personal frustration, it's all emotional. So whatever I feel in that moment, that's what I'm going to do. If I feel like hitting somebody, that's what's going to happen. If I feel like cussing somebody out, that's what's going to happen. When you think about intellectual or organizational types of frustrations, it's more premeditated. So if I do this, this is probably what's going to happen. If I get into a fight at work, I'm probably going to lose my job. If I lose my job, I can't pay my bills. If I can't pay my bills, I'm going to be homeless. I'm not going to have a car. It's more premeditated. All right? The channeling stages comes after frustration has taken place. So typically people are frustrated to the point where, and again, when we think about organizational, which is more what I like to focus on, you have to think about this frustration comes from the fact that, people are giving you feedback or they're giving you suggestions that they don't feel like that they're falling on deaf ears. That's usually where frustration starts. So like I said, let's keep this in the example of the church. Even with using the example of the senior choir and the youth choir. The youth choir is giving the senior choir suggestions about how they can make the ministry better. Because in essence, we said the youth is the future. So they're saying, hey, we should be doing this, is what we love to do. You guys, then the comments probably be made, you guys are dying out. And when you guys leave, this is what it should be because we want to make sure the church grows and continues to grow. I've actually heard that argument. It was kind of off-putting, but I've actually heard that argument. And then you have the senior choir saying, we understand all that, but we've been doing it like this for 30 years. We're the ones that's funding the ministry because we've been given the most in tithes and offering, so we should have the final say. Well, the millennials are going to walk away feeling like, okay, when nobody listens to us, why should we continue to do this? And in these kind of situations, you have to be careful because if it's not family or friends, a constant argument, a constant back and forth can lead to the channeling of fisticuffs or people getting their feelings hurt, things being said that should not be said, especially within the confines of a ministry. But you have to be careful when it comes to frustration because you never know what outlet it is going to take. So that's why I always tell people to be careful in organizations about not taking feedback and not taking suggestions. And even taking that a step further, it doesn't do, because I've seen companies do this. Oh, we're having a meeting, and when we get to the meeting, we're going to talk about everything. Then you get to the meeting and you talk about everything, but there are no actions that are taken from the suggestions that you've gotten. That also can lead to frustration. I think that's actually the most insulting one, because people come in, you say, hey, we're having this great meeting on the 15th, bring all your ideas, bring everything that you're feeling. You get to the meeting, they already have a layout of what's going to happen. You don't even get to voice your opinion. So now it's an insult because you tell us to come to this meeting, bring you all our ideas, all our thoughts. Not only do you not listen to them, you don't even act upon it. So you want to be careful with that. There's actually a segment in the book that talks about feedback. When you solicit feedback and you don't utilize that feedback to make the company better, because feedback can be a two-way street. If done appropriately, it brings up morale. People are happy to come to work. They feel like the company's listening to them. They feel like a contributing member to the company. If you do the opposite, then they stop wanting to come to work. Well, the company doesn't care about me anyway. It's just a paycheck. I can find another company. We gave all these great ideas. We had this meeting. I've heard it 1,000 times. We had this meeting where we sat down. We gave all these great ideas. It's been 2 months. We've seen no actions, no follow-up. Nobody's done anything in regards to the suggestions that we've given. So it's a two-headed sword. So you definitely want to be careful when you solicit feedback, especially if you know you're not going to use that feedback. Okay, so there's kind of, I don't want to say a timeline, but there's kind of a structure by which this all happens. So you have your conflict, which is divided into personal conflict and organizational conflict. And then from there, you have the frustration. And from the frustration, you have the channeling. So remember, with the conflict is either personal or organizational. And when it's personal, you hear phrases like I thought, I felt. When it's organizational, it's more collective. So it's we thought, we felt. And from that, you get your frustration, because all these emotions and all the intellectual part plays into it. You get to the frustration part, and then the next part is the channeling. So what happens when you encounter this frustration, or when your employees or your parishioners or the organizational members encounter this frustration? So then you get into the channeling. And like I said, I love my book, so I'm going to read from my book really quickly. But with the channeling, in the outlook of conflict, frustration will lead to some form of action. Typically either immediate action, which is led from emotional-based frustration, or premeditated intellectual action. The channeling stage comes after the frustration stage has taken place. Personal and organizational conflict both will enter the channeling stage or action stage. During this phase, the frustration, which is brought about by the awareness that there is an issue, begins to seek outlets by which to relieve itself of the frustration. In personal conflict, individuals want immediate relief or specific questions answered. In organizational conflict, the collective desires answers or systems established to bring resolution. The channeling stage typically seeks 3 main outlets: altercations, innovation, or establishment. The altercation outlet is pretty much what it implies. It's the altercation that people get into a fight, that it's personal conflict, violent outbreaks, and organizational conflict can lead to violence or fights. The innovation outlet is one of the better outcomes. It is the outlet that inspires new ideas and new avenues. In personal conflict, it allows individuals to see things differently. They begin to explore avenues that they wouldn't have previously considered. In organizational conflict, it can usher in a new era of creativity or concepts. It helps organizations move into new areas, and it allows members to reach their full potential. All right, the last one is the establishment outlet, which is definitely important for organizational conflict. The establishment outlet places boundaries and paradigms in place. In personal conflict, it helps individuals create boundaries and establish standards. In organizational conflict, it creates new policies and procedures, new paradigms of thought, and it establishes protocol. So again, you have the channeling. So you have the first one, which is your altercation, which is the one we try to avoid, where people want to get into fights or fisticuffs or there are violent outbreaks, which is the one you definitely want to avoid. Or the next one is innovation. Innovation is typically the better outlet, especially if you have a team of creatives, people who like to write poems or like to do music. That's where innovation comes in. It inspires new ideas. people start to look at things the way they normally would not have looked at things. They started looking at it in that way. So whereas it was all doom and gloom, now all of a sudden it's like, well, you know what? Maybe we can do this, or maybe we should try it this way, or no, maybe we should try it this way, or let's consider it this way when you get the innovation. And then the last one is the establishment. So when you establish things, you start putting, especially for organizations, you start putting things into action. So you start coming up with new policies, new procedures, new methods by which to do things. All right? So those are the three outlets you want to think about that come from channeling. So remember, it is the conflict, which is either personal or organizational. Then from there you get into frustration, which is either emotional or intellectual. And from there you get into the channeling, which is either going to bring you to altercations, innovation, or establishment. And again, the latter two are your better bets. So you want to make sure that you try to steer them to innovation. Because again, when you say the word innovation, it means to innovate, to inspire, to get people to think, to come outside of their boxes, to think about new ways. And again, all this translates into your ministries. Because even with your ministry, altercations, never a good outlet. But if you get into innovation, most of your ministries have music ministries. So you have people who write songs. You have people who write poems, Christian music, all that good stuff. If you can inspire innovation, these things will flourish in your ministry. And then you definitely need your establishment, that from the outcomes of, the frustration, you're able to say, hey, well, maybe we should establish a new board. And this new board will look over the way that we do things as it pertains to the different ministries. So you may come up with an auxiliary board, and that auxiliary board's job is to make sure that protocol is followed, that if a suggestion comes across the table, it goes to that actual department, or if somebody comes up with new ideas, it goes to that department. So again, these things translate into your ministries as well. So I don't want you to think that these are all for-profit ideologies. These can also be used in a nonprofit sector, and it yields the same results and sometimes better results because you do find a lot of creatives in the nonprofit sector. All right, so all the information that I gave you for the bulk of today's show is in my book, which you can get on Barnes & Nobles or off Amazon, called Calculated Conflict by yours truly, Ricardo D. Rice, doctoral candidate. And again, it has everything from the generations into it, the whole process I just talked about, from frustration to channeling to the different types of conflict, and a host of other things, which we'll get into in another episode. Now, here's the fun part. So on the break, you will see a bunch of flyers being switched in and out. On May 31st through June 2nd, I will be having my first nonprofit summit in Marietta, Georgia. I know. We hear these things all the time, but nobody's ever done one for the nonprofit sector. So it'll be a host of all my friends. This edition will be the women's edition. So we're having 3 nights of actual church services, which will take place with Dr. Dorothy Boyd Rush, Apostle Deidre Perry, and First Lady Shawn Moss. And those are nightly services, and the actual conference itself, or the summit, is on Saturday, and it's taking place from 11 to 4 at Andretti Indoor Karting Games in Marietta, Georgia. I can assure you it's going to be a great time. It's the women's edition, so they're talking about all kinds of things from the glass ceiling in business to hair care and fitness to actually credit repair and all those good things. Tickets are $25. You can get them on my website at ricecommunity.com. Remember, that's Rice with a W, so WRICE community.com. And hey, I hope to see you there. And yeah, we may or may not be shooting in 4 episodes. I want to see you there. So check it out.